Hi, everybody. It's Susie, and I am back, and we have a new guest with us now. We have Allen Versfeld. And Allen, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, what you do?
Well, my name is Allen Versfeld. I'm a middle-aged white guy in South Africa, so I fit right in. yeah. No. So about 10 years now, I've been blogging for the urbanastronomer.com websites. I think how many years now have I been working with Carnival of Space? It's quite a few, I think.
Probably the whole time that I've been with him, which I think is probably since 2013. So,
Yeah, long
yeah, a long
been doing for
time.
a while. Yeah, and then 2 years ago, I launched a podcast, same name, Urban Astronomer Podcast. We just finished our second season, and we're taking a break now. And that is me. Oh yeah, I should mention, throw some credentials around. I have a director's position at the Astronomical Society of South Africa. Um, Mainly because nobody else wanted the job. It's very administrative.
That works.
Yeah. And so I was technically, I suppose on paper, I was in charge of astrophotography for the country, whatever that means. I just collected pictures and put them on galleries, but you know how the fun. And now they've got me doing citizen science, so it's all very exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of things. And you are now showing up on our weekly space hangout
Yes.
as
I
one
think
of
I've
our
done a few weeks now.
astrojournalists. So,
Mm.
see, we were just pulling you in harder. You know,
Yeah, that started something because I
yeah,
was given an internship for Space in Africa, which is a Nigerian-based space and astronomy. I want to say newspaper, but I don't really call them these days when they're all online. But that's a lot of fun learning how to do it like the professionals do it, which is it's not the way I've always done it.
yeah. And the word professional sometimes is a little you wonder exactly what it means because there's so many of us out doing stuff now.
Well, I've
So,
realized what it means is getting paid, and they're not
yeah,
paying me yet because it's still an internship. But we'll see what happens with that.
working on it, working on it, building up
Mm-hmm.
that resume.
Yeah.
So, astronomy in South Africa. There's a lot more going on there than most of us knew. I remember Pamela did an astronomy cast about it, and I was amazed. So,
Mm-hmm.
why don't I
I'm going
let
to
you start?
Sure. Well, I'm actually taking a bit of a historical point of view here because on the 20th of October next year, the South African Astronomical Observatory are starting their 200th anniversary celebrations with a 3-day symposium, which will be followed by a big public event, a big space festival with activities and visiting schools and whatever. It's going to be a lot of fun. That's being organized by the outreach astronomer, Dr. Daniel Kahnemer, who I got to know a little while ago when I think we interviewed each other for each other's local space podcasts. He does Cosmic Savannah. But every event I've ever been to hosted by SAO, there's always been a talk on the side about the history of the place, and it's just so much that has happened there, and it's been going on for so long, and I think they're fudging it a little bit by saying 200th anniversary, since as an organization they've only existed since the 1970s, but they've been following on, previous bodies who built up from previous bodies who built on from things which started in 1820. When the Royal Navy decided that they were going to build an observatory in Cape Town. They liked it because the French astronomer Lecaille had, I assume I'm pronouncing that right. I know there's an L in there. I think it's a silent L. Nicolas Louis Lecaille. He had 50 years earlier, in the 1750s, he had come to Cape Town and he went and named half of the constellations we have down here. And this being, the 18th century, that's why they've all got names like the microscope and the telescope and the octant and the sextant, the fly.
They have more modern technological names than the Northern Hemisphere
Exactly.
constellations, which were named much earlier. Yeah.
Yeah. They were these mythological things, or even earlier. And here it was all the exciting stuff that had just been invented. The chronometer, those high precision clocks that made it possible to navigate the seas accurately. So he named all these things, named constellations after all these things, and he catalogued stars I think he catalogued 10,000 stars in a single year. Just
Wow.
those basic instruments, yeah, just mapping where they are, writing down the coordinates. And I think, if I recall correctly, the instruments he had available, he was able to measure accurate to 1 minute of arc, which is
That's
pretty
really
good, I
good
think.
for that time period. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't do that with what I've got now, with my, my equipment at home. Um, he also he had heard about these new discoveries that the shape of the Earth was not perfectly spherical, that it was flattened towards the North Pole. So he thought, on his second year here, I'm going to go and find out if it's the same on the South. And he went and he did his measurements. And please don't ask me how. This is beyond me.
He did it somehow.
He did it somehow with
Right.
whatever black magic he had at his disposal, and he found that the southern hemisphere was significantly more flattened, so that the Earth had a slightly pear shape, which
Interesting.
turned out to be wrong. But well, later observers after him figured out what his mistake was. Apparently, his starting and ending points, he had been next to large mountain ranges, and the mass of the mountains had deviated his plumb lines ever so slightly, which is crazy. Just the gravity of a mountain was enough.
Thankfully, no one ever made any globes that were pear-shaped.
Or did they? I don't know.
Or if they did, they would be very valuable right now, because it would have been a short period of time.
So anyway, 1820, the Cape Colony had recently come into possession of the British after various wars with the Dutch, who had originally colonized the area. And it was a very strategically important location, because it's the Cape, bottom tip of Africa, and it was the point where all ocean-going commerce and ships and what have you made a stop on their way to the east, to India, to China, and everything else. So chronometer had recently been invented. I'm not sure if it was even standard equipment on naval ships at that point, but what they needed was an observatory down there, which could provide timekeeping services. So when the ships pulled into port, they can set their clocks again, make sure they're accurate, and to chart the stars so that they can navigate and, they can measure, they would have stars to sight on, know what they were looking at.
Right, because if they're coming from Europe, they're not used to those constellations, and they need to have maps for that.
Exactly, yeah. And Lakai's maps were great, but they were old. And even back then, proper motion they knew about. Stars do move very slightly, so they needed to be accurate. So, yeah, let me just check my notes again. So it was founded officially in 1820, although it took quite a while to actually get going, because it was just a horrible site that they chose. And they built it in the middle of a swamp. It was crazy. Construction was difficult. It took them 8 years to get going. And then fast forward about a century and a half, 1965, the political situation was getting a bit tricky, with the apartheid government just starting to attract a lot of international condemnation. And the British sort of science community decided that they would rather spend their money in Australia, where they wouldn't be seen to be supporting such things. And it was going to be shut down. And the sort of local scientific community, the CSIR, the Center for Scientific Industrial Research, made a deal to keep things running, and as well as merge other observatories. And that's where the SAO was officially founded, and moved all the instruments out into the middle of the deserts, because light pollution was starting to become an issue in those days. And so that's where we are now, with the observatory physically being in Sutherland. So, sorry, this is turning into a big long lecture here. So if you want to interrupt me, if I'm interesting, let me go.
It's actually quite interesting, because you're talking about the light pollution there, and just as an American, I'm not familiar with the area, so I'm going, is there a lot of light pollution there? Was that a major issue? I mean, I'm sure Cape Town is a city, so how far
Cape Town
out?
had problems with Cape Town had problems with air pollution for a very long time. Just dust and smoke being thrown up by railroads nearby. But it was only in the 60s or so that the light pollution started getting bad enough, and they were already surveying, trying to find locations that were going to be good for observing, where there's a stable atmosphere, reasonably good weather year-round, a high enough altitude to be In fact, I'm not even sure that they were doing infrared observations at that point, so they might not have considered it. I actually don't know that. And of course, light pollution as well. It had to be somewhere remote because it's Cape Town is a large city. It's over 1 million people. It's very brightly lit. There's a lot of industry. There's a lot of just the docks and the harbors and what have you. I know that Sutherland, on a good night, which is about, how far is it? About 250, 300 kilometers away from Cape Town. Under good conditions, you can still see the sky glow on the horizon from Cape Town. So it's dim, but it's there once you're dark adapted. So yeah, we definitely have light pollution out here.
Yeah. Well, and that makes sense. I live in the Atlanta area, which is about 3 million in the city. So it's a good size area, and we have a ton of light pollution. So I can imagine that, yeah, Cape Town would definitely have that. How far out of the city is Sutherland? Sutherland is what you said?
Yeah, it's about, well, let me put that in miles. It's about 200 miles, I'd say.
So
it's extremely dark though. Otherwise, that sky glow I mentioned probably wouldn't have been so obvious. Right. It's a sort of place where you can see the zodiacal lights, which really requires perfect conditions to see it. Yeah, but you'd expect that from where they're building. If they're spending the sorts of money they spent to build the SALT telescope, for example, it better be a good size. So,
right. Yeah. So what all kinds of instruments do they have out there?
Oh, a lot, quite a few belonging to. I'll just describe the largest ones. There's the 11-meter SALT, the Southern African Large Telescope. It's pretty well known. The reference I was looking at just now claims that it's still the largest single light collection area of any telescope in the world. I'm not sure if they fact checked that well, because I'm sure there must be, unless they're talking about a single aperture. Right. That might still count, yeah. There's what's the name of it now? There's a 1.9 meter telescope, which they installed in 1975, I think. The Radcliffe instrument, which was bought from a private observatory, which also shut down in the 70s because of light pollution in Pretoria, I think it was, which is where I live. And then a number of smaller instruments and a number of instruments belonging to other projects, like, for example, the what does LCGT stand for? The Los Cumbres. I know it was a Google founder put some of the money into that. It's a network of telescopes around the world. One of their instruments is there.
I know. I'm pretty sure I put it in the Astronomy cast notes, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. I remembered the acronym. Yeah.
Yeah. See, the thing is, every time I look up Sutherland, the list of telescopes just goes on and on and on. They have these
longer and longer.
Yeah, exactly. It's like reading a telephone book.
Yeah.
and I stop paying attention by the time I've got past the big ones that I know. So yeah, but it's there's a lot going on there. Yeah, but what I find interesting is the story behind how the original Royal Observatory was built.
Mm-hmm.
Back in 1820. They set that up. It was founded in 1820 as an in paper. The decision was made. It was the same year that the Royal Astronomical Society was founded. And the way they structured it, you would have like the big man in charge, whose title was, because of course it was a man, 19th century, right? Yes. And the title was His Majesty's Astronomer, which is a very awkward thing to say. The second His Majesty's Astronomer was, and then a couple of assistants. And they sent this guy, his name was, let me see, what was his name? The Reverend Fearon Fellows. And he got sent out, and his first task was to find a place to build this thing. And the requirements were that it needed to be visible to ships in the harbor, except that there was no harbor, just a natural bay at that point. That was the main requirements, and it needed to be suitable for observing. And so they picked a spot that was only 6 meters above sea level, surrounded by swamps on all sides. It was a horrible, horrible location to build it, but it was what was available, what they could buy, and what was visible from both ships. And it took them, how many years? Like 8 years to get things built. He was dealing with all sorts of problems. I said it was surrounded by swamps, but they didn't even have a road going in there. So to go to work in the morning, the astronomers would have to, cross a marsh, wade across a river, and then climb the hill to get to the observatory buildings. Massive problems. The local population weren't happy to be there, which I'm guessing was a historical problem, probably a largely Dutch population, and they just ended a war. Struggling to get materials, and halfway through construction, he had a budget cut. So
That never helps.
Right. So 1828, the main building was up, the instruments were up, his personal residence and his assistant's residence was up, and that was it. No toilets, no fences, no stables, no servants' quarters. Well, I say servants' quarters because we still had slavery back in those days, so it was, but nevertheless, nowhere for them to stay. Not printed in the book I was using as a reference, but mentioned by the author of the book in a talk I went to. Apparently, he had trouble keeping his slaves. Conditions were bad enough that, you would think, I mean, this sounds very strange to say it's difficult to hang on to a slave. The conditions were so bad, they kept running off and never coming back. Keeping staff was a major problem.
Terrain to get away. Yeah.
Right. And of course, the wildlife was a problem. Lack of fences meant that there were nights when they couldn't observe because they were just writing the logbooks. There was a leopard sleeping on the dome. They couldn't open it. So wild conditions there. So it was such a bad conditions that so unsanitary that the fact the poor chap died in 1831 of scarlet fever. And he's one of the two His Majesty's astronomer buried on the grounds. In fact, on the lawns in front of the main building, the grave is still there. It's first time I went there, a big surprise. Why are the graves here? And it turns out, no, this was the guy who built the place. After him came a guy called Thomas Henderson, who absolutely hated it. He lasted 2 years. Very fastidious guy and could not abide the incredibly rough and primitive conditions. He was a gentleman from Scotland, and this was just untenable. But in his time there, he was very primitive. And these guys, they managed to measure the first ever distance to another star, which was Alpha Centauri, because they had the absolute state-of-the-art instruments, and for the first time, they were able to measure those small parallaxes. And also statistics had advanced to the point where people now knew how to make multiple measurements and then combine them and find the averages. And the standard data reduction that we do now had just been invented. So that was enough to get a value for the distance to Alpha Centauri.
So were they pretty close?
Pretty close. Well, the closest that was known until early in the 20th century, before Proxima Centauri was found. The only problem was the readings were still quite marginal, and they weren't really confident enough to publish. They held off and got beaten to the punch by a German astronomer who measured a northern star. Yep. That guy's got the priority for the first discovery. But when they did publish their results the year afterwards, they did get a lot of publicity for it. And of course, it was the closest star, and was until the actual closest star was discovered also. Well, strictly speaking, at the Republic Observatory in Johannesburg, but since that was later absorbed into SAAO, you can say it. I'll give them the credit. Yeah, it's the same place.
Lots of generations of stuff ends up in the same. Yeah.
All piling up together. Yeah.
Right.
So let me see. Where am I now? Yes. He also. Yeah. So having done that, he then abruptly decided he had enough of this, the terrible conditions, packed up and left, went back home to Scotland, and wrote an absolute stink bomb of a letter to the Admiralty saying that, this is appalling. How can you put human beings in this place and expect them to work? And that left them with a problem, because the standards that they had set were only the best people could go. The most highly educated, they had to be people of good character and people of good high importance. And they had to be willing to go about a third of the way around the world to the southern tip of Africa, to this terrible, terrible place, which is where the third His Majesty's astronomer came in. Thomas Maclean was an Irishman. He certainly didn't qualify. He was a country doctor and an amateur astronomer, but he was willing to go. So off he goes. And he brought a lot of his own money with. He spent his own money finishing construction, building the fences, building the toilets and what have you. And he stayed there until he was forced to retire in 1870. So he was there, 40 odd years? 30 something years? Yeah, long time.
Long time.
And in that time, he didn't just do a lot of work for the observatory. He became quite a respected figure in Cape Town society, raising the profile of the observatory from what had once been just this bunch of weirdos coming in from Britain to quite an important center. The observatory ended up being kind of the go-to place for any kind of science and knowledge. They ended up being responsible for weather forecasts. The official weights and measures references ended up being kept there. So a highly respected place. And let me see, what all did he achieve apart from building the place up? Oh, he's the guy who refuted Lakai's pear-shaped Earth. He went on a 2-year expedition, complete with military escorts and what have you, and along much longer baselines for his measurements. And he was the guy who found that, no, in fact, the curvature is the same. It's the same flattening at the poles. And he figured out what had gone wrong with Lakai's measurements. What else? He also employed a precocious young guy, a 16-year-old Charles Piazzi Smith, who was very, very inventive. He invented an air conditioner for the building. He installed a windmill to pump water, so they were able to plant gardens for the first time. And he pioneered photography in South Africa.
Cool.
He'd heard about the works of de Geer and all the others, and he developed his own chemical processes. I wish I could remember the name of the photographic process he used, but it's not a daguerreotype and it's not a cyanotype. It was a different one that he used. And I believe, although they did not take the first astronomical photographs, they missed that by about 30, 40 years, I think. I understand they took the first scientifically useful astrophotography. That story started with a comet that had been seen, and it was a very bright comet, visible in daytime. And a local amateur photographer managed to get a photograph of it and showed it to Maclean, who was very taken with this because he could see stars in the background. He didn't care about the comets. He can see the comet with his own eyes, but there were stars in this picture. And he borrowed a lens from the guy and eventually bought a lens and built a camera, and very quickly found out that although longer exposures would show more stars, they also would smear out because of the Earth's rotation. They're moving. Yeah. So if I understand correctly, and if anybody knows otherwise, let me know. But from my understanding, he did the first piggyback mounts of a camera. He strapped it to one of the 6-inch telescopes they had, and basically pioneered long exposure tracked astrophotography. And for a long time, that observatory was one of the leading centers in the world for that kind of astrometric observations. He pioneered the use of, actually, maybe that's going too far to say they pioneered it, but I know that was definitely one of the leading centers for measuring the brightness of stars photographically. Because you take a photograph of the stars, and if it's a very bright star, it bleeds out to give you a bigger dot on the picture. But it wasn't a particularly precise thing. It wasn't you couldn't really predict. Just because it was this much bigger didn't mean it was that much brighter. There was a large margin of error. So what they developed was the technique of defocusing slightly, which exaggerated the size of the circles. And in that way, they got a more accurate, a more useful, and a more easily measurable circle. And then they used microscopes with little measuring grates on them to do this incredibly tedious work. Like historically, there were lots of, the lady computers working at Harvard, for example. They would employ women to come because they could pay them less than.
Yeah. And they would do the really tedious little math details that the male scientists were like, no, I don't have time to do that. We pay someone else to do that.
Exactly, yeah. But a lot of the work they were doing at the Royal Observatory was not just the mathematical work, the calculations, but also just directly analyzing these photographs and going from star to star, or star, measure its location on the photograph, measure its size, record it all down, move on to the next star, and then do this day after day after day. Apparently, they tended to only last about 2 years because the work was just so mind-numbingly boring. So definitely some unsung heroes there. Yeah. So what else? Where can I go from there? So I've drifted off my notes a bit here.
No,
So
that's
give
okay.
me a second.
I'm looking to see if we have any questions right off there. Someone made the comment, Lim Rimble said, is that what they did with the Hubble Space Telescope? Just a little bit of a defocus. Theirs wasn't on purpose. Yeah, when they
That
first.
was, what do they call it? The most exquisitely engineered mistake ever.
Yes.
It
Yes, it
was
was
so perfectly ground, just to the wrong shape.
just exactly wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
And basically it needed a pair of glasses, and
Mhm.
they were able to go up and do that.
Yeah. So let me
Yeah,
see what else I can say
what
about
are some of
this.
your other favorite points in the history of South African astronomy?
Well, let me see something else. At the beginning of Maclear's time there, he was visited by John Herschel, very well known.
Mhm.
John spent 4 years there, and his project was basically to catalog and map the southern skies again. But he was specifically cataloging double stars and nebulae, so that was a 4-year project for him. They got on very well. They became quite good friends, and Herschel actually went in Bolton Estates, where he lived on and did his own work from. And they worked well together. So that Maclear would provide all the astrometric data, which was actually the purpose of the observatory, right? Because it still belonged to the Navy, and that was their main reason for existing. So he had these excellent data on exactly where every star was. So Herschel could use that as reference points for his work. And Herschel, in turn, was able to use his influence to smooth over administrative problems and just make life a bit easier at the observatory for them. They got on very well together. There was another visitor, maybe less well known, a John Franklin Adams, who was the person who made the first photographic atlas for the entire sky. And he did most of the southern sky work at the Royal Observatory in Cape Town, although he finished the work in the Republic Observatory in Johannesburg. That's some visits, interesting there. What got interesting was at the turn of the 20th century, fashion started changing. Fashion is the wrong word, but you know what I mean. The topics of interest changed from positional astronomy, just basically measuring things. Where are they? How big are they? How bright are they? That basic stuff, to astrophysics, because spectroscopy was starting to gain prominence and start to return results. And Maclear wanted to start doing astrophysics because this was the interesting stuff. Let's find out what's actually happening out there. What are these things we're looking at? And the navies weren't interested. Now, how is this useful? How does this help us to navigate? So the who was the other chap who visited? Goodness. Another visitor was a Mr. Mclean or Mr. Maclean, who I'm not really sure what he was doing there, but they also got on very well, became close friends. And Maclean was a very privately wealthy individual. And he said, well, I can help. Would you like a new telescope for your observatory? And he offered to pay for a new instrument, the sort of large instrument that they needed. And Maclear very gratefully said, yes, please. And basically used everything he had to make sure that it would get there, that a building would be constructed. The Maclean Telescope, as it's now called, is still there, still working, not used scientifically anymore, because it's not easy to move something like that. But it's a 24-inch refractor, enormous thing. But it was actually a triple tubed instrument. So the main tube was a 24-inch, which was corrected specifically for blue light. The blue light would come to a perfect focus, and the rest was not optimized. And the reason they optimized it that way was because it was meant for photography, and the photographic plates that they used responded to blue light. So that was all I had to worry about. The second tube was a 16-inch refractor that was for optical use. So that one had an eyepiece on it. And then there was a little 8-inch finder scope, which I can't imagine using an 8-inch finder scope. That's a big telescope. But the instruments also there was a spectrographic prism, because I don't think refraction gratings had been invented yet. So there was this gigantic prism cut into a circular shape, which if this was the telescope tube, it sat there, and then when you wanted to use it, so I'm guessing they pulled a rope or something, and it plops down, and so they got their spectra. And they did a lot of interesting work with that. That was the oxygen was first discovered in stars using that instrument with that prism. They did a lot of spectroscopic work. In fact, the building that is now the museum on the site used to be the spectroscopic laboratory, where they would sit and burn different elements to measure their spectra and then compare it to what they had seen in the telescope. And then they were, along with the dark rooms next door and what have you. Very interesting museum that actually they've got one of Herschel's original speculum mirrors that he ground. It's lots of cool stuff there.
Well, spectroscopy itself is pretty fascinating because it allows you to tell what things are made from a tremendous distance. And so I can see how they would be fascinated, especially when you look at every star, and every star is a little bit different. And they're going through wait, what's in this one? And then what's in that one? And trying to figure out why they would be different. And I could see that would be pretty fascinating to start doing.
Yeah, I think spectroscopy is probably what really kicked off astrophysics as a field, because for the first time you have it gave you all this extra information. What's the star made of? What elements are out there? What are these nebula doing? And then gradually figured out that the colors shift. Oh, we can also measure the radial velocity of these things. And from there, you can tell how far they're going. And, up until then, it was just points of light with different colors and different... and they'd figured out the different colors meant different temperatures, but that was about as far as they could have gone. But
now they know what elements are there and where they are, how far away they are. Suddenly you've got a tremendous amount more information. So
suddenly you can confirm that, yes, the stars the sun is a star. They're the same thing.
Yes.
Now you can actually see.
So that had to be pretty fascinating to come through there. And probably in the Southern Hemisphere, the majority of professional modern astronomy was going on in that one location. Because, in Northern Hemisphere, you probably had places a little bit more spread out, but that just sounds like it was like the major concentration of everything going on in that hemisphere. So sounds
I know there was work happening in Australia. I'm taking a chance here, speaking out of conjecture.
That's okay. I'm doing it too, so I got you.
I would assume that they started later in the game just because of being more remote. But that's not necessarily true. And I know that there was work in South America as well. But the British were interested in South Africa mainly because, it was the naval connection.
Right. And it was that point that all of the ships were going around. That was how they were having to go to the, to the Far East and that area. And those were very lucrative trade routes. So it made sense that they would want to know those paths. They would want to know the best ways to travel. They would want to make sure their ships could come back.
And it wasn't just commercial. It was the projection of naval power, right? Because that was Great Britain's strength, was their massive, massive navy. It's very, very important to them. And
the ability to be able to get to places and spread out and make colonies and have that empire that the sun never set on there for a while.
Right. And it all almost ended for the observatory in the 1960s because several things had happened. The Navy eventually just lost interest in having the observatory altogether because it became obsolete. Satellites were starting to go up. 60s was a bit early, but the writing was on the wall. And I think it was 1960. Let me just double check. I have a date written down here somewhere. Thereabouts. It was around about early 1960. Control in 1965. Control of the observatory was switched over to the what is the British sort of science research council called? Like a major scientific body, which meant that all of a sudden, instead of being like this. Part of this, instead of having access to a defense budget, they were competing with other observatories in a much, much smaller research budget. Plus, there
Went
was a
from
political
defense to
problem.
science. So yeah,
Right.
the pot got a lot smaller.
Yes, and it got more political because, again, the competition, and then there was the real politics situation, not academic politics, of, well, what was happening in this country at that time. And they began withdrawing funding and saying, we would much rather spend our money on a new telescope in Australia than carry on here. And it was the local scientific community who managed to strike a deal with them and said, it was I think I mentioned earlier, the Center for Scientific Industrial Research.
Mm-hmm.
They struck a deal and said, well, what if we cover 2/3 of all your costs? We pay for all the staff. We run the show. Would you still give us a little bit of funding? And so that's how it worked. It ended up being a 2-to-1 split to keep it going. And shortly before this had happened, they were having their light pollution problems, and at the time, His Majesty's astronomer, I can't believe that title kept going into the 20th century, had begun
It does
surveying.
feel like a mouthful to try to say.
It's dumb. What do you just call him the boss? But they'd already started surveying for a new site to build, and they had settled on Sutherland as the ideal location. Excuse me. And they never got a chance to do that because they started losing funding and everything started falling apart. So the CSIR then took the Royal Observatory, and they took the Republic Observatory, and they took the Observatory of the Cape of Good Hope, and they combined those into one organization, the South African Astronomical Observatory, moved all the most useful instruments to the site in Sutherland, kept the Royal Observatory as the buildings as the headquarters. The Maclean Telescope is still there. It's now mainly used for outreach purposes. And it is an incredible telescope. It's this gigantic dome with a hydraulic floor. Wow. Have you ever seen these pictures of the old observatories where they got the gigantic stepladder on wheels? And then a bigger refractor like that, if it's pointing straight up, the eyepiece is down on the ground, but when it looks lower down, and that telescope might be 5-6 meters long, the side goes up 2 or 3 stories. So they sold it there with this beautiful Victorian engineering. The entire floor is hydraulically mounted and just lifts up and lowers with you.
But it's worth seeing just for the aesthetic value of being able to see their design.
Yeah, it's so impressive how smoothly it moves. The first time I stood on that thing and the guy pulls the big rope, this big old-fashioned mechanism, and you hear this quiet humming in the background, this big air pump going, and the walls started moving up. And it was so smooth that it messed my perspective. We were moving down, but there was no sense of movement at all.
Let me interrupt you really quickly. Oh Bother just came over and rated us with 80 viewers. So welcome all of you people from Oh Bother's channel. We often go over there and rate him after our shows during the week. So thank you so much for coming over and supporting us here on CosmoQuest. We hope you enjoy the content that you're seeing on here. We've got stuff that's going to be going all day. Currently, I've got Allen Versfeld here talking to us about astronomy in South Africa. And we're going to have a lot more things going on throughout the day. So welcome. Thank you for coming. And now let me get back to letting Allen talk. Allen, we just saw that raid, and I wanted to be sure and tell them all welcome and thank you.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you have the extra people listening. I'm not talking into the void. Yeah.
No, you're not. You're talking to people. So that is
good.
That is always a good thing.
Well, I hope nobody's contradicting me on anything, because they might realize I'm not actually the expert.
I have not seen anything in the chat, so you're doing pretty good.
I would have liked to have got, I actually met the guy who wrote I researched before this. I was using one specific book written by, I want to call him a friend. I just haven't met him that often. He retired years and years ago. In fact, I think he's the guy who originally proposed the construction of SALT, Dr. Ian Glass. I think now he just seems to spend his time writing history books. He wrote a history on Lakai, and he wrote the book I'm referring to now. Wow, I had a point here. I started to say something and I got sidetracked.
This is like me trying to do this because this is my debut streaming.
Uh-huh.
this weekend. And I am really learning to appreciate how well Pamela and Annie do it all the time. I,
Mm.
I'm very impressed because it's hard to talk and keep things going at the same time. So
Oh, I remember. I was going to say I
there
would have
you
loved to
go.
have had him sitting here next to me chatting, but it's I find it hard to get hold of him. Unfortunately, he has more interesting things to do than talk to some podcaster in another city. So yeah.
But thankfully, us podcasters keep going out and asking. So,
Mm.
we don't give up. That's the thing. We just start asking more and more and getting this kind of information, especially straight from the sources that do like the textbooks and stuff. That's pretty important to be able to get to them and ask these kind of questions.
Mm.
So don't give up. So, what is your favorite part about specifically being in South Africa to do astronomy? What is your favorite that makes it different from other places?
There's two things. South Africa, generally, we just have the most amazing skies, as in we've got the most amazing things to look at.
They are on my
You
bucket
know,
list. I do want to come and
mm.
see South African skies because I've never seen Southern Hemisphere stuff.
Oh, you're in for a treat. It's
Yes.
good. Constellations like the Southern Cross that are so distinctive, much smaller than anybody expects when they see it for the first time. Yeah, you can probably hide the whole thing under a closed fist.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's compact. It's very distinctive. I should have got myself a glass of water before I started.
I know. I have mine over here, kind of out of view, but yeah.
So things like the planets, they pass directly overhead here because of the angle of the ecliptic. So when we see Jupiter, we see it. We always have a good view of it every year.
Wow.
Let's see. Yeah. Globular clusters. We've got Omega Centauri, it's so big it looks better in binoculars than a telescope. It's about the size of the full moon through binoculars. It's
wow.
actually
That
maybe
is amazing.
that's maybe a little bit excessive, but through a telescope, it's the size of the full moon. It's just this big hazy thing. In fact, through a telescope, because it fills the field, you don't see a globular cluster. You just see a hazy area. It's a binoculars object to my
mind. And that's one thing. Whenever people ask Dr. Pamela what telescope should people start with, she always says binoculars. So,
agreed.
Yeah, it's a good way to start.
Yeah, they don't see as much technically, but you use them more, so they see more. You see a lot more. I think, what was it? Yeah, a couple of years ago, when I got my binoculars, I've been without a telescope for a while, and in just 1 hour of just scanning, I saw more objects than I'd seen in my life before with a little telescope. So, yeah,
it's probably easier to locate with the binoculars if you're just out there, and you're learning how to do it. It's just easier to be able to scan across the sky and find things. Because,
well, it's that wide field of view. You can see so much sky at the same time. With a telescope, you're trying to find a little nebula or something, and if you miss it, you'll never know. You might have missed it by only this much, but you didn't see it. Okay, with go-to telescopes, it's a different story. Now you just push the buttons and then it finds it.
Yeah,
but
the fancy new ones.
But you still don't get that glorious view. It's amazing. Yeah. We weren't talking about binoculars, were we?
We were talking about your favorite things about astronomy in South Africa specifically. Yeah.
Okay. So the other thing I like, and this is more the specific area where I live, up on the Highveld, so Johannesburg, Pretoria, that sort of area. In the winter, at least, we have excellent seeing for very long periods. So up to 2 weeks with no clouds in the sky, that's quite something. Of course, you pay for it in summer when you might have 2 weeks of rain, but
yeah.
So I don't get to see a lot of Orion, but Scorpius is. Oh, I know that backwards by now.
And from what I understand, seeing is how clear the air is, how much the atmosphere is kind of interfering with your view of what's going on. Is that correct?
I was
as a layman.
I was speaking very imprecisely there. I was just talking about general quality of view,
Or
which
just
includes
general
weather
view.
and light pollution and what have you. Yeah. So yeah, technically speaking, it's the atmosphere is turbulent, right? And if you ever looked at the bottom of a swimming pool and
Mhm.
seen how the light dances and moves because the waves on the surface of the water refract the light,
Right.
and it's not quite the same thing with the Earth's atmosphere because it's more different pressure density regions, but you get that same
That same
refractive effect.
fuzziness that
Mm.
comes.
So if you look with a telescope, for example, at the moon on a night of bad seeing, you just won't be able to get a good focus. And as you watch, it'll shift and shimmer, and then it'll become sharp, and then it fuzzes away, and that's bad seeing. So visually, you can kind of get past that if you're patient and you just stare with one eye open until the seeing clears momentarily. Photographically, you're shot. You don't have a chance because
Right.
it's a long exposure. It all just gets blurred together. So if you can find a place that's got a very stable atmosphere, and that often means high altitude, then that's great for observing. Especially if you're using for professional observing, where time is money, and it actually is very important to get the results that people are paying for.
Yeah. So in the winter, you have beautiful seeing out there. You have gorgeous views and amazing sights that those of us in the Northern Hemisphere don't get to see. It sounds like a gorgeous place to go.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I've missed out on a couple of things, like the Andromeda Galaxy. That's right down on the horizon for me. I've seen it, but I don't think I've seen it properly. I've never seen the Big Dipper. Don't know what that looks like. I don't know how big it is. Polaris. I've heard of this one thing, and I'm very jealous. So it must be nice to have a polar star to line your telescope on. But never seen. Actually, no, I lie. I have seen that. I got sent on a trip to the Middle East once. It was in Saudi Arabia.
Above the equator. Yep.
And it was literally the only star I could identify because the light pollution was so bad. I think I identified and so I've seen that one.
So at some point you'll have to make a trip up to the Northern Hemisphere and take a look at it all. And a lot of us need to come down to the Southern Hemisphere and go see it. I believe, let's see who in the chat was saying, they were saying, I think it was Bill Nash who was in there saying that the Southern Cross just pops right out at you when you're looking at it. I'm looking at that.
Well, there's two constellations next to it, one constellation and one asterism, which can fool you because there are two other crosses next to it. There's the Diamond Cross, which is made up of stars from two separate constellations, and then there's the False Cross, which is a similar one. The Southern Cross is the smallest one, it's the brightest one, and it's got the two pointer stars pointing at it. But I know when I was a kid, they always mixed me up. So
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, and for all of us that haven't seen it, I'm sure it would be amazing to be down there and have a good guide who can point things out to us and say, this is what you're looking at here. That would be pretty awesome. Well, I think we're wrapping up on our time. I believe they're ready to start running some of the dog videos to give us a little break now too. But remind people where they can find you.
Well, I would point you to the podcast, but that's on hiatus until about January or February. But why not? You can listen to the back catalog at the website. I was about to say,
they can listen to the back catalog. Yeah. Tell them where to find it.
Sure. It's, you can just search for Urban Astronomer on iTunes or any of the things, or you can go straight to the website, urban-astronomer.com. There's podcast links all over the place. You can find subscribe links for everything. You can also see some of my writing at the Space in Africa online news source. I'm trying to recall the URL for that. I've only been writing for them for about 3 weeks, so I haven't memorized all the details.
It's a brand new job. That's awesome.
And let me see. And of course, weekly Space Hangouts. I show up there about once a month. I'm on there. And I believe, on social media, you'll find me on Twitter at @UAstronomer. Letter U Astronomer. Although I don't talk a lot of space there. Yeah.
But if somebody needs to tweet you, then politely.
Yeah.
All right. I think what we'll do is we'll let you go. Thank you so much for being with us. And I will be talking to you again fairly soon in emails, Carnival of Space stuff. But thank you so much for being on here and talking to us about this, because
absolute delight to be here. Thank you.
So much fun. Well, all right, we will let you go. And I think, Pamela, are you ready to switch me over?
I am totally ready.
All right. I'm going to take a break. I will be back at midnight to talk to y'all again. But Pamela's going to take back over, and I think we've got folks to get us through until then. So thank you all for watching. Thank you, Oh Bothers Group, for coming over in the raid, and I'll see you in a little while.
Okay, we are going to dog cam and an ad.